Chapter 25. Lawless Alliances. No alliance is permitted with foreign nations who do not share in the covenant and the covenant faith. Exodus 34:12-16, Exodus 23:31-33, Deuteronomy 7:1-6. It's impossible to understand this law unless we recognize that treaties, covenants, and marriages are legal arrangements. Every religion has its own system of laws, and in various cultures, many evils have been legal. The sati, or burning of widows, human sacrifices, ritual prostitution, bestiality, homosexuality, murder of aliens, and so on. Religion has as its expression an ethical code and a system of laws. Law and morality differ from religion to religion. Marriage, for example, has a different meaning to a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Buddhist. Differing moralities are all in some sense and at many points warring moralities if two persons of differing religions marry. If two persons of differing religions marry, there will be either conflict or surrender. All such unions, personal, that is marital, or by international treaty, are thus forbidden. In the 20th century, some nations have actually seen words and meanings simply as potential investments of war, ways of deluding and overcoming others. For this reason, no religious intermarriages are permitted, nor treaties with nations with ungodly faiths. This is one side of this law, no covenanting of any kind, either on the personal or the national side with the ungodly. Another aspect of this law assumes the likelihood of conflict. Then there is a requirement, when the enemy is defeated in the event of war, to destroy the temples and images of their false religion. This carries the war against their false religion rather than their persons. Hang on. Didn't quite hit it right. This carries the war against their false religion rather than their persons. Because every law system is an expression of a religious faith, we cannot view other law orders as comparable. We cannot view other law orders as comparable to ours. Laws can embody evil as well as good. The fact something is called law does not make it good. Over the centuries to the present, much evil has been made into law. When man makes law, law will reflect his evil. We therefore must look to God for just laws. The goal of the 20th century has been the rule of international law, a radically humanistic concept which requires the death of all other legal systems, most prominently the Bible. The biblical. Most prominently the biblical. To seek such a law, that is, international humanistic law, is to violate the fundamental commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," Exodus 23. All alliances which set aside biblical premises are unholy alliances, and they incur the judgment of God. God's law here is clear, and yet, by and large, the churches have been silent concerning it, one of the sad facts of our time and an invitation to judgment, 1 Peter 4:17. There is no penalty here, except the judgment of God. Alrighty, let's continue by continuing. A cunning plan, I realize. Chapter 26. The Source of Law. When God begins the Ten Commandments with the words, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 5:7, he not only bans the worship of any other gods, but also the acceptance of any other laws than his own. Because he is the Lord who delivered his people, quote, out of the house of bondage, Exodus 22, out of slavery, he especially has the doubly legitimate claim on them to obey his law. He is, first, their creator, and second, their redeemer. Hence, obedience to his law is mandatory. In any system of thoughts, the effectual God of that system is the source of law. He is the definer. In any culture, the definer determines and identifies the meaning of things. In any culture, the definer determines and identifies the meaning of things, and their qualities, whatever is, can only be known in terms of the defining factor. In the Bible, God is the creator, determiner, and the definer. In Genesis 2, Adam is given the task of naming the animals, that is, classifying them, for to name means to define and classify. This is to be done under God in terms of his creating purposes. The naming meant to understand God. The naming meant to understand God's creative order. Now, without biblical faith, both man and the state will play God. This is original sin, Genesis 3:5. God is a necessary concept in human thought because some kind of ultimacy must exist. If not God, then man. For example, Randall Craig Fastnack Jr. For example, Randall Craig Fastnack Jr. in Life Child, The End of Poverty, the case for licensing all parents, gives us a Darwinian faith. He presupposes the necessary total control of man by a world state to eliminate poverty, retardation, disease and death. All youth must complete 2 years of national service. All couples are limited to 2 children. All births must be licensed. Prior to conception, all couples must have lived together for 3 years, whether married or not. World poverty, death, war, hunger, nuclear weapons, and more must be eliminated. Must be eliminated. This movement, quote, points that man is God, end quote. Virtually no freedom is left. Virtually no freedom is allowed to individuals, but they are to think of themselves as God. Cash will be eliminated. There will be a search for intelligent life on other solar systems with the assurance, quote, that those civilizations are at least 1 million years older than ours, end quote. A major good, quote, is the elimination of death. Within 50 years, we could have the capability to live forever with healthy bodies and minds, end quote. This would mean 2042 at the latest. There will be population control, a computerized and full history for every history. A computerized and full history for every citizen will be compiled and will be available to anyone, and so on and on. Given the premise that man is God, this is a logical perspective, but since man is not God, the logical alternative is that God is God and his law must bind us. For the churches to be antinomian is to shift the source of law from God to man. Having done so, it is logical. Having done so, sorry, I just forgot. Having done so, it is illogical for them to quibble when the state legalizes abortion, homosexuality, or anything else. They have already transferred the lawmaking, defining, and determining powers from God to man and the state. The hostility to theonomy and Christian reconstruction rests in the recognition that such a faith refuses to surrender God's claims on man and the state. Fastnacht, having defined God, quite logically transfers lawmaking, defining, and predestination to the state. Too much of the thinking within the Church is illogical. It represents a syncretistic approach, a combination of those elements in Christianity and humanism most congenial to the religious dilettante. I like it. Most congenial to the religious dilettante. Such a perspective has proven to be an avenue to both success and impotence. If our source of law is not God, we shall have tyranny in the name of sweetness and light. In the summer of 1996, the Spartanburg, South Carolina County Council, disturbed by the Hang on, I made a funny noise with my nose there. Let's get rid of that. In the summer of 1996, the Spartanburg, South Carolina County Council, disturbed by the growing endorsement of homosexuality by officials of public education, passed a resolution condemning such stances and affirming, quote, the standards to which this community subscribes, end quote. A great outcry resulted, led by pro-homosexuals and by the media. The Greenville County clergy issued a statement which said in part, quote, we believe that sexuality is a deeply personal matter about which reasonable and godly people have vastly differing opinions. We feel that this is properly a matter between a people and their God. We believe that the real knows no bounds of... What? We believe that the real standards of our community are honesty, integrity, cooperation, respect for the law, and willingness to contribute time and energy to the life of the community. Good citizenship knows no bounds of religion, skin color, ethnicity, or sexual lifestyle. End quote. Such statements by the clergy are now routine. Respect for what law did these... Hang on, that was a bit of a funny clause there. Respect for what law did these clergymen of Greenville County call for? God's or man's? Obviously, God's law was in no way considered as a valid standard. Of course, the business community very early surrendered to the pressure by the pro-homosexuals. A moral capitalism is the ever-increasing ally of anti-Christianity because a moral stance is intolerable where profits are involved. Modern-day capitalism often does not believe in a free market, preferring a controlled one. Being capitalistic no more ensures goodness than does being a church member. The spirit of Pilate marks much of history. When Pilate said, "What is truth?" John 18:38, he was not asking a question, but rather dismissing the subject as unrealistic, impractical, or utopian. Pragmatism marks their perspective. But, as St. Paul warns us, quote, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Galatians 6:7. Huckle-duckle, time to go make record. Chapter 27. insane thinking about the law. I frequently get telephone calls and letters attacking me for affirming biblical law. The questions begin thus: do you believe that homosexuals should be executed? My answer always is simply that God so requires it in the Bible, and as an interpreter and a believer in the Bible, my answer always is simply that God so requires it in the Bible, and as an interpreter of and a believer in the Bible, I do not believe that I have the right to disagree with God. The next question is usually this: how then can you be a Christian since Jesus said, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone, John 8:7. I try to explain that, first, an ancient premise of law requires that those who take part in a trial have clean hands in the matter. That is, no thief can take part in a trial for theft as a credible witness. Second, if no man can be a part of a trial unless he is sinless, then since we are all sinners, there can be no law, no courts, no police, no penalty for crime, since we are all sinners. I can't do that. Since we all are sinners, this does not seem to disconcert most questioners. This means that contemporary antinomianism is moving logically and steadily into the thinking of the Marquis de Sade. Sade held that any act committed was a natural and therefore a good act. Theft, murder, rape, incest, sodomy, and all the sins condemned by God, being natural, were therefore good. Only Christianity and its faith and law were evil because they were supernatural. It's interesting that the first question is usually about homosexuality. In personal confrontations, such questioners commonly refuse to answer the question, are you a homosexual? Or, why are homosexuals such a key concern for you? Homosexuality has become a central intellectual concern because it is a central offence against God and the essential burning out of man and is burning out of man in his hatred of and war against God. In Romans 1:27, burned should be translated as burned out. Questions about God's law on homosexuality are ways of challenging God's moral status. Some questioners insist that Jesus demanded the death of the law, despite his statement in Matthew 5:17-19. Such opinions reflect William Blake and ancient and modern Gnosticism. Another statement common to such critics is that to affirm God's law is to affirm hate. But hatred of what? To affirm God's law means that one wants to protect people from rape, murder, theft and lawlessness in all its aspects. In the post-World War II years, I have unhappily known of many, many cases of rape, some of particularly vicious and sadistic character. Whom do these antinomians propose to love? The rapists or the victims? Some will insist on demanding that we hate the sin and love the sinner. But sin does not exist in the abstract. It is an act of men and an expression of their nature. It is an act of men and an expression of their nature. Some rapists have laughed in the faces of their victims and have held that they did them a favour. A person's acts do not exist in the abstract, in some strange realm, while he continues as an innocent man whom God supposedly requires us to love. The love the sinner, hate the sin idea goes back to the Hellenic paganism and its virtual divorce of the body from the mind. Modern man's love affair with the homosexual is really a hatred of God and a love affair with himself. He will answer when challenged about his concern for the homosexuals that he has no use for them. He is concerned about their civil liberties. He wants a free and open society, and so on. And so on and so on. Of course, there is commonly an insistence that the biblical texts about homosexuality shall have homosexuality. Of course, there is commonly an insistence that the biblical texts about homosexuality refer to male prostitutes. Implicit in their reasoning is the premise: if God tolerates him, he must certainly tolerate me. One man said that he would like to be on our side and would be if our affirmation of God and moral law were a more general one. Men and women have often insisted that they love their spouse and their adulteries must be understood in context. The total context of our lives is the triune God, his law word, his atoning work in Christ, and more. If we do not take his law in all its facets seriously, we cannot appreciate his atoning work. Let's try that end bit. We cannot appreciate his atoning work. Look at that beautiful waveform in the morning time and evening time. In the summertime, the winter time, the autumn time, when the leaves fall down. Very nice. All right. If you like this work and you'd like to support it, say thank you. Help me do more better work. Go to nathanteacher.com. Drop me some PayPal monies, monthly or one-off. Chapter 28, The Golden Rule. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbour, and not suffer sin upon him. Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. I am the Lord. Leviticus 19, 17 and 18. In the New Testament, we see the Golden Rule cited in Matthew 7:12, 22:35-40, and Luke 6:31. Our Lord tells us in Matthew 7:12, "This is the law and the prophets." Compare Matthew 22:40. In other words, the essence of the law is the love of God and the love of our neighbour, so that every law given by God has this as its goal. The love of our neighbour cannot be reduced to an emotion or a feeling. To love God means to obey his law. As our Lord tells us, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." John 14:15. If we keep God's commandments, we thereby manifest our love towards him. If we keep God's law with regard to our neighbour, we do not kill. We respect his life as God-given, not under our jurisdiction except in a God-given. Try again. Just a bit lost there. Not under our jurisdiction, except in a God-given ordained court of law. We do not commit adultery to destroy his marriage. We respect its sanctity. We do not steal because we respect his property, nor do we bear false witness against him, thereby protecting his good name and God's law. Neither do we covet anything that is his, so that, in word, thought, and deed, we manifest love towards him, for love is the fulfilling or putting into force of the law. Romans 13:8, Exodus 20:13-17. Our love of neighbour means keeping God's law in relationship to him, and this is a powerful social force, whereas our claim to an emotional love is usually a shallow deception, or at best a small thing compared to God's law. To love our neighbour as ourselves means that we give him the same protection of God's law that we ourselves want. The peace and security of life and property which we want, we give to others by placing God's law first. We are not the premise of God's social. We are not the premise of social order, nor is our neighbour, but God is. We therefore can best express a love for our neighbour through our obedience to God's law. No human penalty is attached to this law. Social disorder and anarchy are the God-ordained penalties. But God both blesses and punishes more thoroughly than man can. Before World War II, much use was made of the Golden Rule in public discourse. This has since ended, so that many are ignorant of what it was, and in practice there is too often hostility to other people. All right. Gonna let that do us for that chapter. Chapitre.
Chapitre, capítulo, capítulo 3, capítulo 13, capítulo.
All right. Onwards and upwards. Chapter 29. A Holy Nation. The covenant people must establish a holy, covenantal nation. Exodus 19:6, 22:31, 23:24 following. Leviticus 19:2, Deuteronomy 7:6, 14:2, 21, 26, 18-19. In all their ways, God's people must manifest their holiness. Their every activity, to the very food they eat, must show that they have an unrestricted dedication and devotion to God and His law word. Here, as elsewhere, God gives no punitive power to man. Just as violation of the dietary laws brings its own penalties upon us, and just as a disregard for God's law limiting the extent of debt brings judgment upon us, so too a people's refusal to be a holy nation is its own punishment. To be a holy nation means that God's purposes prevail over personal and national wishes. In Exodus 19:6, this means being a nation of priests, end quote. A priest dedicates himself and all that he has to God's service. A nation must likewise be a holy nation. Our holiness is apparent in the details of life. Thus, our diet must not include an animal, even if a clean one that is torn by wild animals. Such meat must be given to the dogs. Exodus 23. Exodus 22:31. This also means no participation in pagan worship. Paganism cannot be allowed at any public function. Obedience here will bring health and prosperity, and the implications is that disobedience will bring the reverse. Exodus 23:24 following. Because God is holy, we must be holy. Leviticus 19:2. Holiness will bring the blessing of God. Deuteronomy 7:6-11. God has chosen us by His grace and mercy. Our actions must manifest our gratitude. Deuteronomy 14:2-3, 12. Deuteronomy 14:2-3, 21. We gain greatly by our covenant obedience. Deuteronomy 26:18 following. The emphasis in the idea of a holy nation is on God's grace and then on our gratitude. Disobedience begins with the illusion that God's covenant law is a restraint upon a people's freedom rather than the ground of it. Wow, just under 30. Wow, that's great. One, two, buckle my shoe. There we go. One for the money, two for the... Rather than the ground of it. To see God's law as a limitation on us rather than our empowerment is the beginning of apostasy. More than once in history, Christian nations have seen themselves as a new Israel of God. There's nothing wrong with this, and Paul in Galatians 6:16 sees the Christian community as the Israel of God. That this concept has been abused does not diminish the fact that the churches and the nations are called to be God's chosen peoples and instruments. Apart from this calling to be a holy nation, the various states pursue a course of self-aggrandizement, humanistic messiahship, and pragmatism. To be a holy nation means to see the priority of God and His law in all things, and to make true justice the goal of society. All right, thanks very much for tuning in. Wow, we're coming up to almost the halfway mark, so that's great. Great to make progress. Hope you're benefiting from this, and hope to see